In 1914, three of the most powerful empires in human history were still standing. The Ottoman Empire, 600 years old, stretching across 3 continents, ruling over 20 million people from the Balkans to the Arabian Desert. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, 400 years old, the beating heart of Central Europe, home to 11 different nations living under one crown. The Russian Empire, the single largest nation ever to exist on Earth, spanning 11 time zones, commanding the world's biggest army, ruled by a czar who believed God himself had placed him on the throne. 3 giants, 3 ancient, deeply rooted civilizations that had survived plagues, revolutions, and centuries of warfare. By 1918, all 3 were gone, not reformed, not defeated and rebuilt, completely and permanently gone, and the chaos left behind, the borders, the broken promises, the power vacuums, didn't just reshape 1918. It created the Middle East conflict, gave birth to the Soviet Union, handed Adolf Hitler his opening, and planted landmines that are still exploding in our world today. This is the real story of World War I. Not the trenches, not the mud. The story of how 4 years of war killed 3 empires and cracked open a century of consequences nobody has fully recovered from. To truly understand what was destroyed, you need to first understand what existed, because most people have no idea how dominant and how ancient these 3 empires actually were. The Ottoman Empire was not some medieval relic by 1914. It was a functioning, complex imperial state that had ruled continuously since 1299, over 6 centuries. At its absolute peak in the 1500s under Suleiman the Magnificent, it controlled the entire Middle East, all of North Africa, and a massive portion of southeastern Europe. It sat at the crossroads of the world, controlling trade routes between Europe and Asia, between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. By 1914, it had shrunk considerably, losing territory in the Balkans, in North Africa, in the Caucasus. European powers mockingly called it the sick man of Europe. But it was still standing, still governing, still controlling Constantinople, one of the most strategically important cities in human history, and still holding the title of Caliphate, the spiritual leadership of the Islamic world. That title alone gave the Ottoman Sultan religious authority over hundreds of millions of Muslims across the globe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a different kind of beast entirely. It wasn't built on ethnic unity, it was built on managed diversity. 11 major ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, Slovenes, Romanians, Italians, Serbs, and Ukrainians, all living under one imperial roof. That sounds like a recipe for chaos. But for centuries, the Habsburg dynasty made it work through a careful balance of power, shared institutions, and strategic compromise. By 1914, the empire covered most of Central Europe, modern-day Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, and parts of Poland, Romania, and Italy. It was the 3rd largest country in Europe by population and the 4th largest by area. Its capital, Vienna, was one of the great cultural cities of the world, home to Freud, Klimt, Mozart's legacy, and some of the finest universities on the continent. And then there was Russia. The Russian Empire under Tsar Nicholas II was simply enormous in a way that is hard to fully comprehend. 11 time zones, 1/6 of the Earth's entire land surface. A population of 125 million people spread across Europe and Asia. It had survived Napoleon. It had survived the Mongols. It had survived the Mongols. It had survived internal rebellions and assassination attempts on its rulers. The Romanov dynasty had sat on the Russian throne since 1613, over 300 years of unbroken imperial rule. These were not fragile states. They were ancient, deeply embedded systems of power. And yet, beneath the surface of all 3, cracks had been forming for decades. June 28, 1914, the city of Sarajevo, Bosnia. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the entire Austro-Hungarian throne, is riding through the city in an open motorcade. A 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip steps forward and fires 2 shots. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are both dead within the hour. What followed should, by any reasonable logic, have been a regional diplomatic crisis, a localized confrontation between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Instead, it triggered the most catastrophic chain reaction in modern history. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and issued a humiliating ultimatum. Serbia refused key terms. Austria-Hungary declared war. Russia, which had positioned itself as the protector of Slavic peoples, began mobilizing its army in support of Serbia. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. France, bound by treaty to Russia, was pulled in. Germany then invaded neutral Belgium to reach France, which immediately brought Britain into the war. In exactly 37 days, a regional assassination became a continental war involving every major power in Europe. But here is what makes this story so much more than a simple domino effect. Each of these three empires didn't just get pulled into a war. They entered it already carrying deep, structural fractures that had been building for decades. The war didn't create their weaknesses. It simply found them and tore them wide open. Russia, the first to fall. Russia entered the war with the largest army on the planet. It also entered with the worst logistics, the most corrupt supply chain, and a czar who was dangerously disconnected from the reality his soldiers were living. By the end of 1915, Russian casualties had already exceeded 2 million. By 1916, that number had climbed past 5 million, dead, wounded, or captured. Soldiers were sent to the front without rifles and told to pick up weapons from fallen men. Artillery units ran out of shells mid-battle. Supply trains broke down hundreds of miles from the front lines. Men froze in trenches without winter coats while warehouses full of coats sat undelivered in Petrograd due to administrative collapse. Back home, the situation was no better. Bread shortages hit the cities, fuel ran out, inflation destroyed the savings of ordinary families. And while all of this happened, Tsar Nicholas II left the capital to personally command his armies at the front, leaving the government in the hands of his wife Alexandra, who was herself heavily influenced by Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whom the Russian aristocracy viewed with a mixture of horror and contempt. In February 1917, women textile workers in Petrograd went on strike over bread shortages. The strikes spread. Crowds filled the streets. The Tsar ordered the military to suppress the protests. The soldiers refused to fire. Some of them joined the protesters instead. Within 5 days, the 300-year Romanov dynasty collapsed. Nicholas II abdicated on March 2, 1917, not after a great military defeat, not after a palace coup, but simply because there was no one left willing to hold the system together. 8 months later, Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution. The Russian Empire officially became the Soviet Union, and the ideological conflict that would define the entire second half of the 20th century was born in that moment, 30 years before anyone called it the Cold War. The Ottoman Empire. Death by dismemberment. The Ottomans made what would prove to be a fatal strategic decision. They entered the war on the side of Germany and the Central Powers in November 1914. It made sense on paper. Germany was powerful, modern, and had been helping modernize the Ottoman military for years. But when Germany lost, the Ottomans lost everything. The 1920 Treaty of Serres was essentially a document of imperial execution. Britain claimed Iraq and Palestine. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. Greece was awarded large portions of western Anatolia, the Ottoman heartland. Italy received territory along the Mediterranean coast. What remained of the empire was a small, humiliated rump state. But history rarely moves in straight lines. From the ashes of that humiliation rose Mustafa Kemal, a brilliant military commander who had distinguished himself at Gallipoli. He rejected the Treaty of Sevres entirely, launched a war of independence against the occupying powers, defeated the Greek army in a brutal campaign, and renegotiated an entirely new treaty at Lausanne in 1923. Modern Turkey was born, but the broader Ottoman world was gone forever. The Caliphate, the office of supreme Islamic spiritual leadership that had existed in some form since the 7th century, was formally abolished in 1924. The religious and political authority it represented didn't disappear. It shattered into fragments with dozens of movements and rulers claiming pieces of it ever since. That vacuum has fueled religious and political conflict across the Muslim world for 100 years and continues to do so today. Austria-Hungary, the empire that dissolved. Austria-Hungary's ending was perhaps the most surreal of all three. It didn't collapse the revolution. It didn't lose one decisive battle. It simply came apart at the seams, peacefully, almost quietly, as its constituent nations walked out one by one. As the war ground on and defeat became inevitable in late 1918, the 11 ethnic groups within the empire stopped waiting for permission. Czechoslovakia declared independence on October 28th. The state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs declared independence on October 29th. Hungary declared full independence from Austria on October 31st. On November 11, 1918, the same day the war ended, Emperor Karl signed a document suspending his participation in government. He didn't formally abdicate. He genuinely believed he might return. He never did. He died in exile in Madeira in 1922, at the age of 34. Where one empire had stood, 7 new nations emerged within weeks. And the borders drawn in those chaotic, rushed weeks were so poorly constructed, cutting through ethnic communities, separating peoples with shared identities, grouping together groups with ancient grievances, that they became a slow-burning fuse. That fuse finally exploded in the 1990s, when Yugoslavia tore itself apart in a series of brutal ethnic wars that shocked a Europe that had convinced itself such things were history. 4 years, 3 empires, a century of open wounds. The Middle East as it exists today, every border, every conflict, every sectarian tension, was largely constructed on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire by British and French diplomats, who prioritized their own interests over the realities on the ground. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret deal between Britain and France to divide the Middle East between themselves, is still one of the most consequential and most resented agreements in modern history. The Soviet Union, born from Russia's collapse, would go on to fight a Cold War against the West for 45 years, bringing the world to the edge of nuclear annihilation more than once. And the humiliation piled onto Germany after W1, the war guilt, the crushing reparations, the economic devastation created precisely the conditions of desperation and rage that Adolf Hitler exploited. World War II was not a separate event. It was World War I's unfinished business. We call it the First World War. But perhaps a more honest name would be the war that broke the world's foundations. Because everything built since has been built on ground that was never fully repaired. The fallen empires of 1918 didn't just die. They left behind a blueprint, a warning about what happens when ancient systems of power collapse faster than the world can replace them. That warning is still relevant. More relevant, perhaps, than most people are comfortable admitting. This is the fallen empire, and we're just getting started.